Welcome to our 7th newsletter and episode of the Caregiver series. And today we're going to be talking about grief and virtual learning. There's been a lot of kids have been responding in very different ways than we would normally see. And one thing that we noticed is really that this is a sign of grief. And so today, Kaelee Heidemann, the counselor at Traeger, is going to be here to share with us some ideas on what grief is and how to help our kids and even ourselves as we move through this totally uncharted territory. We also have Mary Dietrich here. Mary, if you want to say hi.
Hi, I'm a behavior interventionist for Traeger Elementary and Lakeside Elementary.
And then Kaelee can introduce herself and then she'll get started with her presentation.
Hi, everyone. So I am the school counselor at Traeger Elementary, and I also have a lot of experience with grief. So I have been working with a grief camp since 2013, but also have done a lot with grief that's not just death related. All right, so something that a lot of people think about in terms of grief, their minds automatically go to those death losses, and that's certainly a huge part of grief, but it also occurs after a whole bunch of different kinds of losses. So we might be grieving the loss of a friendship, of our home, of safety or normalcy, and that I think is especially what we're seeing now in terms of grief is that loss of safety and normalcy. COVID has come with a ton of different kinds of loss and grief. So children have lost that sense of safety and routine that a school provides for them. They've also lost any of that connection that they might have with friends. And of course, our teachers are working so hard to get kids connected virtually, but we all know it's not the same. And so that face-to-face contact is something that I certainly am grieving, but our children are also grieving. And as caregivers, you might also be grieving too. And there are also those losses that come with that economic impact of COVID. So some of our students have had to move. And so they're in a new place, or there are new jobs that people are experiencing. So this work schedule is a little bit different. And so we're grieving that kind of loss too. Like I always knew that my caregiver was going to be home at this time. And when I came home from school, or when I was done with my schoolwork, this person was home for me. And now that schedule is a little bit different. So there are lots of different arrangements that it can cause that grief.
I think it's really cool too, Kaelee, how you mentioned that grief is like not just the death thing, because that's definitely the first thing that comes to my head. So yeah, that's a great point that it comes with just that any kind of loss.
Yeah, and there can certainly be those layers to it too. And, as COVID continues to occur and we are starting to know more people who have died from COVID, that's definitely a layer that adds to it. And then I think about how challenging that can be with all those other layers of grief that COVID has caused.
That's what I was going to say too. I think that layer also of the extension of how long this is taking, right? Because we've never ever thought that we would be in it as long as we have. And I think so many things, it's kind of like that step ladder of that piece of just not having things the way that it used to be. And it just that layered effect is scary.
Yeah. And like the support that we would have had normally does not occur in the same way either. So even though we're experiencing these things and there are all these other supports that might exist, like I think about for the death losses, the summer camp that I work at did not happen this summer. And then I volunteer with a grief group for kids, and that's taking place virtually. So it's not happening in the same way. So any of those supports that were previously out there now either don't exist or look different. And so that just like compounds that as well. So I want to talk a little bit about what grief can look like in children, because as adults, we often have this idea of like, this is how I grieve and this is how I act, and you're supposed to look sad and you're supposed to cry, but kids grieve so much differently than we do. And it doesn't just happen in one way. And that's true of adults too. Like not all adults will cry and look really sad after experiencing a loss. So it's not fair for us to put that on kids either. So we know that children work through their emotions by playing. And a lot of times we think like if they're playing, that's not normal. Something's wrong with them. They're not okay. And I need to get them to cry and sit down and have these really hard conversations with me. But children learn so much and process so much by play. So they might be reenacting things that have occurred for them, like with their dolls or their cars or whatever it is that they have. When they're playing video games, which is something that we've seen a lot of, especially in this virtual world, they might be talking to their friends about things and talking about the things that they miss. And we don't realize that that's truly them grieving and working through that. So some of the other things that we might notice behavior-wise is that kids might withdraw and not want to talk about anything. On the flip side, they might also become really hyperactive. And sometimes we see that like ADHD response, and we automatically want to diagnose kids as having ADHD, even though it's grief or trauma that they're experiencing, which is a result of COVID as well. We might see some of that increased sensitivity where before, if their sibling was making fun of them, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was just like, yeah, my brother is being kind of mean to me right now and they're making fun of me. But now when it's happening, they break down and cry right away because they're so much more sensitive than they were. You might see some emotional outbursts. A lot of times that presents itself as anger, and you'll see like that extreme rage. I've had a lot of families talk to me about that, where they're just like, my kid is out of control and I don't know what to do about it and I don't know where it's coming from. I think a huge part of that truly is grief. And you might also see some of those things like increased appetite or a lack of an appetite, some emotional eating going on, and the list truly can go on and on forever. It's not just one thing, and it really does look different for everyone, which is why it can be so tricky to really like understand and conceptualize grief.
And, as a parent too, I feel like that is one of those things that you're all of a sudden starting to notice because you have been home with your children doing school more than what you ever had anticipated in your lifetime. And that's the piece where I feel like parents are getting to know their kids in that aspect better than what they would have ever had done before. And that's it. That this worked yesterday, but I don't know if that's going to work today. And will it work tomorrow? And, that hug that was great yesterday. Well, we tried that the other day and they wanted no part of that, so I really think it's that give and take piece of trying to figure it out emotionally, because guess what? Us adults are going through it as well, right? Because our work stuff looks different for us too. So you're right. It is a really difficult piece that I think it's hard to meld it all together because everybody is going through it so differently and we've never experienced it for such a long period of time. And it's scary to a lot of us, because as parents, we want to solve it and we want to make it right as teachers too. And I think that's the difficult piece here. Sometimes you're not exactly sure what to do.
Absolutely. And then if you have several children and they're all presenting this in a different way, plus the way you as a caregiver are presenting your grief, you could be dealing with 4 or 5 different symptoms of grief and not know how to help any one of them, or one solution isn't going to fit for every single person in your family.
And I think as a parent, that's kind of like, I'm reading this list and looking at it as like a parent eyes, my daughter, and it's making sense that some of these things could be grief. And I love how, as we move into the next slide, you really do a good job explaining how we can, as caregivers, acknowledge that that's happening and then how we can respond to it.
Yeah. So I think one of the most important things when kids are grieving is giving them that permission to ask questions and then giving yourself permission to respond to them honestly. And sometimes being honest means saying, I don't know, or I don't have the answer. And I know that as adults, that is so hard for us when we want to fix things for kids. We want to be able to have that Band-Aid or that magic cure that's just going to make everything better. But the reality is that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know for sure how long we're going to be in this situation. And while it can certainly be hard to say those things, showing your vulnerability to your children is such a huge thing. And it shows that you are human too, and you are also experiencing those things. So showing that you're grieving, totally okay. And I think a lot of times we have that mindset of like, I want to be strong for my kids. And at the same time, our kids are thinking, I want to be strong for my adult. And so then nobody's expressing anything. And it becomes like this huge wall that we don't intend to put up. We will have the best intentions and like, I want to be there for them, and that means I can't be there for myself. But really, it's allowing yourself to feel those things and allowing your kids to feel those things too. So I think a huge part is just giving them that space to name what it is that they're missing. Saying, I really miss hanging out with my friends. I miss going to school. I miss seeing my teacher. And let them list as many as they can. And then you can list your things too. I miss going to work. I miss being able to do these things with my family and all that kind of stuff. And I think when you give voice to that, that can be really powerful, because if we try to sweep it under the rug and not acknowledge it, it just builds up in us, and it's there anyway. So we might as well give us the space to do that.
And I think as a parent, I tend to feel like I need to be the fixer. And so when my daughter shares something like that with me, that she's missing a friend or missing her teacher, then I end up saying, well, yeah, but we can do this, or yeah, but at least you get to see them on the computer. And I think it's important as parents that we really try to hold back our yeah buts. And like you said, just give space for the feelings. One thing that I do to really acknowledge that it's super easy is just state it back to her. Like, your friends, I understand, and let her move on to the next thing. It's a good way to acknowledge the feeling without having to fix it and still giving you something to say.
Absolutely.
And I also think too, just stepping forward and having that really difficult conversation, as a teacher as well, both being a parent and, a teacher, that's it. Having that difficult conversation, stepping forward, all of a sudden that builds that relationship one step further than what it was before, when you actually take the time to listen. And when you do that, I think that just creates that honest piece, and that piece that, I can have this hard conversation with my mom or with my teacher, and they are going to give me that time. That acknowledgement, building it, that makes your relationship so much stronger, I feel like. And like you said, Kaelee, and you, Michelle, as well, it is that actual listening piece and the acknowledgement of, I know this is so hard and I really can't fix it. Because as a parent, we can't fix everything, and as a teacher either. But that you just give them that moment to listen, I think that just makes everything all the better, because they do feel listened to. And I think that's part of the problem today. Kids just want to be heard.
Yeah, that validation is so huge. And that's really all it comes down to. Like, we all feel so much better when we know we're not alone in that. And even when we know that the other person can't make things better, a lot of times that's not even what we're looking for. Like, I know that this situation is hard and I know that you can't fix it for me, but I just want you to know, I just want to know that you're feeling that too, or you're feeling similar to that. Because a lot of times we want to say, I feel exactly the same way. And even if we're feeling similarly to that, we don't exactly know how that person is feeling. So by saying I feel similarly, or this is what this is like for me, I think is that validation piece too, without trying to cover it up and say, I do know exactly what you're going through, because while we're all kind of in the same storm, our boats are a little bit different in that storm. And I think coming up too, especially as we think about the holidays that have passed and the holidays that are coming forward, we know that family traditions will look different for a lot of people. And it can be really easy to dwell on that, hey, this is so hard and I miss this so much. And instead of dwelling on all that hard stuff, it's certainly okay to feel that and express that. But you can think about other ways to make those times together special. Maybe instead of your typical traditions with extended family, you're staying as that tight family unit and you're playing board games instead, or you're staying up late and drinking hot cocoa together, or you're hanging out in your PJs longer than you normally would. And that time, I think, can still be so special, because that's time that you didn't get before. And so maybe some new traditions will be born out of that we'll really come to appreciate by keeping those things smaller and really enjoying that time together, especially because I know that as we're spending more time at home, we also are getting more frustrated with people. So if we can kind of celebrate our togetherness for a little bit, that will be really healthy for all of us.
Awesome. Well, Kaelee, thank you so much. The one thing I do want to ask you while we have you here and we're talking about grief is, I know traditionally grief they used to at least say that grief operated kind of in a linear or like a line. So you accepted it after you acknowledged it. Is that still the case, or would that look a little different?
So we have definitely kind of moved away from that idea of linear progression because it's so different for everyone. And once you've moved beyond, they used to call it the stages of grief, and a lot of people still practice that, but that's definitely something that I don't really abide by anymore because, you know, once you are into this stage, it kind of implies that you can't go back and experience those other things again. But I have definitely experienced those times where, like, I feel like I'm in a really good place and then something will happen. And so now I'm back at the beginning, if we're going to call it in that order. So really, it's such a fluid thing. And something that was really helpful for me in understanding that was like grief is kind of like a ball in a box, and how it like bounces off all these other corners and things like that. And you've got this tangled knot. And that's really what grief is like. It's not this smooth, pretty easy line. It's really all over the place. So there are times where we're certainly going to be in a better place, and then something else might happen and we end up in a tougher place again. And sometimes we're in that tougher place for a little bit of time, and sometimes it's a lot longer. So there's just like, there's no one way that grief looks like. There's no one way that it occurs in that order either.
Awesome. Thank you, Kaelee, for your time today.
Great stuff. Great examples. Just, you nailed it. It's awesome.
Thanks for having me.